In 1820, a lady, somebody or other, I forget her name, said that a man might establish his celebrity by the excellence of his turnout. In other words, carriage building had now reached a fine art in such a way that people were judged by their carriages, people now judged by their cars. Not just by their carriages, but by carriage, harness and horse all together. That combination is called the turnout. And by my grandfather's time, this book, which looks like a nice piece of antique quaintness nowadays, but in fact was a very modern book expressing the attitudes which were regarded as important in those days, details all the turnouts. In fact, it actually in here talks about the 8 vehicles and 10 horses which an ordinary man needs in order to establish his station in all the activities of life that he carries on. There's the family carriage, which would be the equivalent of a rover, say, and the varnished country brake, which would be the equivalent of a Land Rover. And then there's the chariot, which was the Ferrari of its day, and the little pony chaise that the children were taken out in by the governess, which was the sort of Austin 7 or Mini of its day. And so it went on. It included the town carriage, the brougham, which was invented by Lord Brougham, which was always painted black because you weren't allowed in those days into the forecourt of Buckingham Palace during the long years of the Queen's widowhood, except in a black carriage. And now, when I was young, the taxis were still black for that reason. And so it went on. And the turnout, horse, harness, and carriage was the phrase that was always used. In fact, now and again in the country, there were turnout sales where they didn't sell horses. They weren't horse sales or carriage sales. They sold the whole equipage, so to speak, as it was put together. These sales were not common in London, in the cities, because the most extraordinary thing about that whole age of great horse driving was that most of the vehicles didn't belong to people. They didn't belong to the rich, because in London there were, in my grandfather's time, about 60,000 turnouts being driven by people, and 45,000 of them were provided by job masters who contracted with people to provide them with the sort of turnout they needed, and even in many cases the drivers, because they couldn't do that in the country, because they couldn't gather together a sufficient population in such a small space that would give them a big enough public to allow them to deal with business in this way, because after all the carriages could only go at the most 5 or 6 miles on their way to work every morning with the driver. And so it was only in the country, in the main, that turnouts got sold as one piece. When I was young, it's quite common. They still were. This is the last turnout sale I saw. It took place this year. It wasn't very grand. It was very about knockabout turnouts belonging to people who mess about in the countryside. But he's never seen one of those before. He's never seen an open drain before, that pony. But he has come in from the countryside. But thus they sold them horse, harness, and vehicle. And thus people were judged by what they drove. It's interesting, the one people that the job masters actually hated contracting to were people who really worked their horses. Nobody would contract, for instance, to a general practitioner, because his horse was out all day long and might be called out in the night, and so on and so forth. They liked to contract their turnouts to the sort of people who just did one trip round the park every day, or at 11 o'clock in the morning went down Bond Street, and in the afternoon went out to tea with somebody. Still, here we are. We can still see a turnout sale. And as a matter of fact, that little Welsh pony there, she's come up rough from the field with all her coat on, but she was a darling, been driven a bit by what we call the hiss and hold method. She wanted to come to terms kindly with the new owner who knew how to handle her mouth, but she had perfect manners, beautifully made little pony. I had the greatest difficulty with not taking her home. In fact, it's a very, very dangerous thing for me to go to a horse sale of any kind. This business of judging by turnouts still exists, of course, in the British Driving Society, which is a society of drivers nowadays who don't compete in performance, like some of that is, but in fact turn themselves out with the greatest elegance they can and actually give prizes for elegance at all their meets. Keeping up the way people were judges some time ago. But here's another matter. Here's a turnout that belongs to me. This is a little cobby pony, hard little country sort of farmer's pony called Beauty, Cucci as she got called originally, that's the Romany for Beauty. And she's driving, you see, in a breast collar, in brown harness, and because it's a breast collar it has to have a whippletree to take the rub out of the shoulders. That's that bar across there, and because it's got a whippletree the chains can make it pull direct from the axles of the cart. You see, those chains run back to the hubs of the cart, which means that when she pulls over the rough ground and up the hills to the countryside, there's no pull on the body of the cart at all. There's no strain put on the body of the cart at all. She's only just pulling on the axle, and the cart is riding without strain on top of it. And the wheels are enormous for a little 12-hand thing. They're 49 inches, those. And that is the sort of wheel which you would normally get on a very, very much bigger carriage. And little carriages for little ponies like this usually have small wheels which run in the bumps, but it was done by altering the springing. You see, instead of the long spring, there's a double elliptic spring, two springs meeting into one another. And it's the way those are tucked up at the side of the body which enables those big wheels to be put on this cart. Now this was a development of carriage making in its day, small carriage making, quite equal to Mr. Izagonis's decision to put the engine sideways on a Mini and thus make the design of the Mini possible. And this is called the Battleston cart. They were built for a short period at Battleston, which I think is on the Kent-Sussex border, and about 2 or 3 people are around there. They were absolutely beautifully built. They very soon got a reputation for being the most comfortable of all small pony carriages. See the beautiful way all the seats move and everything like that. And they give you an impression of being in quite a big vehicle with room and comfort and smoothness because of the large wheels, all because of that one piece of progress which was made by the man who thought of putting the springs on this particular cart in a particular way. And this one was built in 1905 for a titled family called Rees in Hampshire, and it still is absolutely in its original paintwork. The only thing that's altered about this over the years has been that it's had new cushions on the seats. I'm talking like a vintage carman. Well, it gets like a vintage carman with this, because now I'll show you something very interesting. Here's another Battleston cart. And although 9 out of 10 of the parts of this cart are identical, and the springing is identical, nevertheless it has quite a different character. For instance, you'll see the lamps which went on tucked between the mudguard, under the mudguard alongside the cart on that one, went on the dashboard in this one. And this one is driven by a pony who's wearing black harness, in other words, smarter town harness. You always drove brown harness in the country and black in the country, in the town when I was young. If you drove black harness around the country when I was young, somebody said, well, you're going to a funeral or something. But anyway, this means that it was probably used in smarter circumstances. And because it's got a neck collar, it doesn't need a whippletree. And the truth of the matter is that this is ladies' Battleston. The first one, they were all built individually for individual people, and the first one was built probably for a farmer, country chap, takes strong cobby pony. This one was built for a lady. And you'll notice that the wheels, in fact, are slightly shorter, and that brings it a bit lower, and the step is very, very low indeed. That's because it was built in the days when ladies wore long skirts right down to the ankles, and they wanted to be able to get decorously and comfortably into the cart. She's got an extra seat there on the driver's side to hold her well up above the horse, because driving a little horse in a little cart, everybody always likes to be as high above a horse as he can when he's driving it. The other thing is that the mudguard, you see, runs the whole way down the side. Down it comes until it virtually meets the step, and it covers the whole of the front of the wheel, which means she could step into this without any danger of her skirt touching the muddy wheel as she went back. And that is why, of course, that on the ladies' Battleston, the lamps have had to go up the front, because there's absolutely no room for them in the other place because of the long mudguards that were there to protect the skirt. And of course the great joke about the women's one is that although these are almost identical in dimensions everywhere, the seat on the women's one is 4 inches wider, which either means bigger behinds or bustles, perhaps for generosity's sake. We ought to say the latter. So there they are. A man's Battleston and a lady's Battleston, and into the lady's Battleston goes a bow-top whip. Of course that would be appropriate. Tremendous amount of important considerations of this sort in the old business of the snobbery of turnouts, and the man's cart's got a drop-thong whip. And there they stand side by side. Now, just as the vintage car people nowadays can tell you, I was looking at a vintage car that's being done up the other day, and the chap said to me, there's only 6 of these, you know, still running in England. And they're getting a bit like this now about the famous old carts, because somebody said to me the other day that there are only 6 12-hand Battlestons still in England. Well, I don't know if it's true, I hope it is, because I've got 2 of them. Anyway, I should like to know if anybody knows how many of these things there really are. I'll show you those whips. First of all, the drop-thong whip. Now this was the working whip. It was the one that was used to the farmer going to market, and by the trader and so on. It's made of steel, and sometimes originally of whole whalebone in the great days of whaling. It's whipped all the way with whipcord. That's where the phrase of whipcord comes from. All the way up like that. Coach whipped. It has a leather handle. It is silver mounted. It's got a tremendously heavy knob there, lead loaded in order to give it balance. It was also a terrible weapon for fighting with, actually, on market day. And as it got near closing time at the end of the day, I've once or twice in my childhood seen a number of people setting about one another with the butt ends of those buck-thong whips. And the best of those are called Peterboroughs. And this is the bow-top whip. And this was usually made of white holly. See, it had a silver end with the owner's initials on it, A-E-H. That's Arthur Hargreaves, my old uncle. And this is made of wangi cane. In place of the holly, a lot of new materials were coming from the Empire, and this one proved to have exactly the right spring and taper for making these whips. So Uncle Arthur had a wangi whip, and this is the bow top. And the bow top, which is very important, that it shouldn't drop away, was done by a piece of whalebone and then goose quills all whipped in together like that. That's it. Cheerio. And I'll just go and do my practice.